The cold December wind cut through the torn fabric of Greta's uniform as the military truck bounced along the broken road. It was 1944 and the war had turned against Germany. The Western Front was collapsing. American forces were pushing deeper into German territory, and everyone knew the end was coming. But knowing the end was near did not make it easier. For Greta and the other women sitting in the back of that truck, the end might mean something worse than death. Greta was 28 years old. She had worked as a nurse in the Wehrmacht medical units for 3 years. She had seen men die screaming. She had seen boys younger than her little brother take their last breath calling for their mothers. She had wrapped bandages around wounds so terrible that she still saw them when she closed her eyes at night. But nothing had prepared her for this moment. She was now a prisoner of war. Beside her sat Liesel, a young woman barely 22 years old. Liesel had been a communications officer, working with radio equipment behind the lines.
She had never fired a gun.
She had never hurt anyone, but now she wore the same chains as everyone else. Her hands trembled as she held them in her lap. Her eyes were red from crying. Though she tried to hide it, there were 12 women in total. Some were nurses like Greta. Others had worked in communications, supply depots, or administrative offices. The German military had used women in many roles as the war dragged on, and more men were needed at the front. Now these women were paying the price. They had been captured 3 days ago when American troops overran their position near the Belgian border. The rumors had started immediately. The older women whispered about what the Americans would do to them. Everyone had heard the stories. Some said the Americans treated prisoners well. Others said it was propaganda. There were darker rumors too, stories that made Liesel cry herself to sleep at night. Greta tried not to listen to any of it. She tried to stay strong, but even she felt fear creeping into her heart like ice water. The truck hit a large hole in the road and everyone lurched forward. One woman cried out in pain as her shoulder hit the metal side. The American guard sitting near the back did not react. He just stared ahead, his rifle across his lap. His face showed nothing. Greta studied him carefully. He looked young, maybe 25. He had not been cruel to them. He had not been kind either. He simply did his job. Greta thought about her family back in Munich. Her mother and father had not heard from her in 2 months. They probably thought she was dead. Maybe that would be better than knowing she was a prisoner. Her younger brother Hans had been killed at Stalingrad 2 years ago. Her father had cried for 3 days straight. Her mother had never recovered. Now Greta might never see them again. The landscape outside was destroyed. Villages lay in ruins. Burned tanks sat abandoned in fields. Telephone poles leaned at crazy angles, their wires hanging like broken spiderwebs. This was what war did. It destroyed everything. Greta had once believed in the cause. She had believed Germany was fighting for its survival. But now she was not sure what she believed anymore. She just wanted to survive. After 2 hours, the truck began to slow down. Greta felt her stomach tighten. Through the gap in the canvas covering, she could see tall wire fences. Watchtowers stood at the corners. This was it, the American prisoner camp. The women began to whisper nervously. Frau Hoffmann, the oldest among them at 43, started to pray quietly. She clutched a small wooden cross that she had hidden from the guards. The truck stopped. The engine died. For a moment, everything was silent except for the wind. Then the back of the truck opened and bright winter sunlight flooded in, making them blink. An American soldier stood there, gesturing for them to get out. Greta went first. She climbed down carefully, her legs stiff from sitting so long. The other women followed. They stood in a line, surrounded by American soldiers. Some of the soldiers stared at them with curiosity. Others looked away. An officer approached, a tall man with a stern face. He spoke in English to one of his men, who then spoke to the prisoners in broken German. They were to be searched. They were to follow the rules. Any resistance would be punished. The women were led to a building where female American staff members searched them. They took away anything that could be used as a weapon. They took watches, jewelry, belts. Greta had a small photograph of her family in her pocket. The woman searching her paused when she found it. She looked at the photo, then at Greta. For a moment, their eyes met. Then the woman handed the photo back. Greta felt tears sting her eyes but forced them back. After the search, they were taken to a long wooden barracks. Inside were rows of bunk beds. The building was cold but dry. There were blankets on each bed. It was better than Greta expected. Much better. But she did not let herself feel relief, not yet. This could still be a trick. As the sun set on their first day as prisoners, Greta lay on her bunk and stared at the wooden ceiling. Liesel was crying softly in the bed below. Outside guards walked past the windows. Somewhere in the distance, someone was playing music on a radio. It sounded like American jazz. Greta closed her eyes and tried not to think about tomorrow. She tried not to think about what would happen to them. She tried not to think about anything at all. But sleep would not come easily. None of the women slept well that first night. They lay awake, listening to the sounds of the camp, wondering what fate awaited them in this strange place where their enemies now controlled their lives. Morning came too quickly. A loud bell rang at 6 o'clock, shattering whatever sleep the women had managed to find. Greta sat up immediately, her heart pounding. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then reality crashed back. She was a prisoner. She was in an American camp. This was her life now. The door to the barracks opened and an American soldier entered with a woman in uniform. The woman spoke in perfect German. Her accent suggested she was originally from somewhere in Austria or perhaps Switzerland. She told them to get up, make their beds properly, and be ready for work assignment in 15 minutes. There would be breakfast first. She spoke without emotion, as if reading from a script. The women moved slowly, still exhausted and frightened. Greta helped Liesel, who seemed unable to stop shaking. The younger woman had barely spoken since they arrived. Greta worried about her. Some people broke under this kind of pressure. She had seen it happen to soldiers at the field hospitals. Their minds simply could not handle what they had experienced. They were marched to a mess hall. Inside, the smell of food made Greta's stomach growl despite her fear. They had not eaten properly in days. The last meals with the German army had been thin soup and stale bread. The supplies had run out as the front collapsed. Now they stood in line with metal trays like schoolchildren waiting for lunch. The American soldier serving food placed scrambled eggs on Greta's tray, real eggs, then a piece of bread with butter, then a cup of coffee. Greta stared at the food in disbelief. This was more than German soldiers were getting at the front. This was more than civilians back home had seen in months. She looked at the other women. They all wore the same expression of confusion and suspicion. They sat at long tables and ate in silence. The food was good, too good. Greta's mind raced. Why were the Americans feeding them so well? What did they want? She remembered hearing about how the Russians treated German prisoners. They starved them. They worked them to death. But this was different. This felt wrong because it felt too right. After breakfast, the work assignments began. The Austrian woman with the perfect German read names from a list. Some women were assigned to the laundry, others to the kitchens, some to cleaning duties around the camp. Greta and Liesel were both assigned to the kitchen detail. They would help prepare meals for the American soldiers. The work was hard but not cruel. The American cooks showed them what to do without yelling or hitting. They peeled potatoes. They washed dishes. They swept floors. The Americans mostly ignored them, focusing on their own tasks. One young cook, a boy who looked barely old enough to shave, tried to smile at Liesel once. She turned away quickly, terrified. During a break, Greta stood outside the kitchen watching the camp. American soldiers walked past, talking and laughing. Some played cards at a table near one of the barracks. Others worked on repairing a truck. It looked almost normal, like a regular army base during peacetime. But the watchtowers reminded everyone what this place really was. And the guards with rifles reminded the prisoners what they really were. Greta noticed something else, too. The Americans looked at them differently than she expected. Some showed curiosity, some showed what might have been pity, but she saw no hatred in their eyes, no cruelty. This confused her more than anything else. She had been taught that the Americans were enemies, that they hated Germans, but these young men looked like they just wanted to go home, same as everyone else. By the end of the first day, Greta was exhausted. Her feet hurt. Her hands were raw from washing dishes in hot water. But she was alive. They were all alive. And they had been fed 3 times. As they returned to the barracks that evening, Frau Hoffmann spoke quietly. She said maybe they would survive this. Maybe the Americans were not monsters after all. But Greta was not ready to trust yet. She had learned during the war that things could change quickly. Kindness today could become cruelty tomorrow. She told the other women to stay alert. Do the work. Keep quiet. Do not cause problems. Survive. The second day was much like the first. Wake up, eat, work, eat, sleep. The routine was almost comforting in its predictability. Liesel began to speak again, though only in whispers. She told Greta about her family in Hamburg. Her father had been a teacher. Her mother had died in an air raid 2 years ago. Liesel had joined the communications corps because she had nowhere else to go. Now she had even less. On the third day, something changed. During their morning work in the kitchen, Greta overheard American soldiers talking. She understood a little English from school, though not much. But she heard certain words clearly. Christmas, 3 weeks celebration, the Americans were planning something for Christmas. Greta felt a strange pain in her chest. She had forgotten Christmas was coming. She had forgotten that the world still turned, that holidays still existed. That evening, she told the other women what she had heard. They received the news with mixed feelings. Christmas had always been a special time in Germany. Family gatherings, church services, songs and cookies and warmth. But this year there would be no family, no home. Just this camp and these enemies who fed them and put them to work. The days continued. The work continued. The women began to relax slightly, though none of them would admit it. The Americans remained professional. The food remained good. No one was beaten. No one was abused. It was strange and unsettling in its normalcy. Liesel started to notice one particular American soldier. He was young with red hair and freckles. He worked as a guard but never seemed threatening. Sometimes he nodded at them as they passed. Once, when Liesel dropped a bucket of water, he helped her pick it up without saying a word. She did not know what to make of him. 2 weeks passed. Then 3. The weather grew colder. Snow began to fall. The camp took on a different appearance, white and almost peaceful. The American soldiers put up decorations. Green pine branches. Red ribbons. Someone set up a small Christmas tree in the main administration building. The German women watched all this with growing confusion. What were the Americans doing? Why were they celebrating when there was still a war? Did they not understand that men were dying every day? That cities were burning? That the world was falling apart? Greta did not have answers. She only knew that each day she survived was a gift. Each day without violence was a miracle. She kept her head down and worked. She helped the younger women stay strong. She tried not to think about home or family or what would happen when the war finally ended. But deep in her heart, something was changing. She could not name it yet. She could not even acknowledge it to herself. But it was there, growing slowly like a seed in frozen ground, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Christmas Eve arrived cold and gray. Greta woke that morning with a strange feeling in her chest. She had been a prisoner for nearly 4 weeks now. 4 weeks of work and silence and uncertainty. 4 weeks of watching American soldiers prepare for their holiday, while the German women tried not to think about their own families back home. The morning routine began as always. The bell rang. The women dressed quickly in the cold barracks. They made their beds with military precision, knowing the Austrian woman would inspect them. But something felt different today. Greta could sense it in the air. The other women felt it too. They exchanged nervous glances but said nothing. They walked to the mess hall for breakfast. The American guards seemed different somehow, less serious. Some were smiling. One guard whistled a tune as he walked past. This made Greta more nervous. In her experience, when soldiers acted happy, it often meant something bad was about to happen. She had seen officers laugh and joke right before ordering terrible things. She gripped Liesel's arm as they entered the mess hall. Breakfast was the usual food: eggs, bread, coffee. The women ate quickly, not talking. After they finished, they expected to be dismissed to their work assignments. But instead, they were told to remain seated. All the German prisoners, male and female, were told to stay in the mess hall. Something was happening. An American officer entered. He was older than most of the soldiers, maybe 45. His uniform was neat and decorated with ribbons. He walked to the front of the room with confidence. Behind him came a younger soldier and the Austrian woman who translated for the prisoners. The room fell completely silent. The officer began to speak in English. His voice was firm but not harsh. He spoke for maybe 30 seconds, then paused. The Austrian woman stepped forward and translated his words into German. What she said made no sense at first. Greta was sure she had misunderstood. The officer's name was Captain Miller. He was the commander of this prisoner camp. He wanted to inform all prisoners that today, Christmas Eve, there would be no work assignments. Tomorrow, Christmas Day, there would also be no work. The prisoners would remain in their barracks or could walk in the designated areas of the camp. But they would not work. It was Christmas. The mess hall remained silent. Nobody moved. The women looked at each other with confusion and fear. This had to be a trap, had to be. Why would the Americans give them days off? What did they want? What were they planning? Captain Miller continued speaking, and the translator continued repeating his words in German. He said that Christmas was a time of peace and goodwill. Even in war, some things remained sacred. The American military believed in treating prisoners with dignity and in accordance with international law. Today and tomorrow, the prisoners would be treated as guests, not as workers. Guests. The word hung in the air like something impossible. How could prisoners be guests? It made no sense. Greta felt her heart beating faster. She looked at Frau Hoffmann, who sat across from her. The older woman's face showed the same confusion and fear that Greta felt. Captain Miller finished speaking. He nodded to the prisoners and left the mess hall. The guards remained, watching the prisoners carefully. The Austrian woman told everyone to return to their barracks and wait for further instructions. The prisoners stood slowly, moving like people in a dream. Nobody spoke as they filed out of the mess hall. Back in the women's barracks, the fear and confusion exploded into worried whispers. What did it mean? Why were the Americans doing this? Some women thought it was a test. Perhaps they wanted to see who would try to escape. Perhaps they were looking for an excuse to punish someone. Others thought maybe the Americans were going to execute them. Maybe this was how they did it in America. Give prisoners one last day of rest before the end. Greta tried to calm everyone down. She said they should wait and see. Panicking would not help. But inside, she felt the same terror as everyone else. She had learned not to trust unexpected kindness. Kindness usually came with a price. They waited in the barracks. Minutes felt like hours. Some women prayed. Others sat silently on their bunks. Liesel cried softly, thinking about her last Christmas at home before her mother died. That had been 2 years ago. Everything had been normal then. Or at least it had seemed normal compared to now. Around midday, a guard came to the barracks. He told them, through gestures and simple words, to stay inside and rest. He pointed at the bunks, made sleeping motions. Then he left. The women looked at each other. Rest? They were supposed to rest? Greta lay on her bunk and stared at the ceiling. She tried to understand what was happening. The Americans had every right to work them hard. Prisoners in most camps worked 12 or 14 hours a day. Some were worked to death. But these Americans were telling them not to work. On Christmas, because it was Christmas. She thought about Christmas before the war. Her family's small apartment in Munich. The smell of her mother's cooking. Her father reading from the Bible. Hans, her brother, excited about his presents even though he was 16 and pretended to be too old for such things. That had been 1938. The world had still made sense then, or at least she had thought it did. Now it was 1944. Hans was dead. Her parents might be dead too, killed in one of the Allied bombing raids that struck Munich regularly. And she was here, in an enemy prison camp being told not to work because it was Christmas. The world had gone insane. As afternoon faded into evening, the women remained in the barracks. They talked quietly among themselves. Some shared memories of Christmas past. Others wondered what would happen next. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Everyone expected something terrible to happen. Kindness was always followed by cruelty. That was what they had learned from this war. But nothing terrible happened. The guards walked past the windows as usual. The camp remained quiet. As darkness fell, snow began to fall outside, covering everything in white. Through the barracks window, Greta could see lights in the American buildings. She could hear distant music, Christmas carols. American voices singing about peace on earth, peace on earth. What a joke. There was no peace, just death and destruction and suffering. Just people like her, trapped in places they never wanted to be, waiting for an end that might never come. Then, as the evening grew darker, a guard came to their barracks again. This time he was accompanied by the Austrian translator. She told the women to prepare themselves. In 1 hour, they would be escorted to the mess hall. There would be an event. They should come as they were. No special clothes needed, just come an event.
What kind of event?
The fear returned stronger than before. This was it. This was when the truth would be revealed. Whatever the Americans had planned, it was about to happen. Greta felt her hands begin to shake. She looked at the other women and saw her own fear reflected in their faces. Even Frau Hoffmann, who always tried to stay strong, looked terrified. They had 1 hour. 1 hour to wait and wonder and fear. 1 hour before they discovered what the Americans really wanted from them. 1 hour before Christmas Eve became something they would never forget. The hour passed too quickly and too slowly at the same time. Greta and the other women tried to make themselves presentable. They had no good clothes, only their worn uniforms. They had no way to fix their hair properly. They looked exactly like what they were, prisoners who had been working hard for weeks. But they did their best. Something told them this moment mattered, even if they did not understand why. When the guard came to collect them, the women formed a line outside the barracks. The night was cold and clear. Stars filled the sky above. The snow on the ground reflected the camp lights, making everything seem almost magical, almost peaceful. But Greta's heart pounded with fear. Beside her, Liesel trembled so badly that Greta had to hold her arm to keep her steady. They walked across the camp toward the mess hall. As they got closer, Greta noticed something strange. Light poured from the mess hall windows, more light than usual, and she could hear voices inside. American voices, singing. They were singing Christmas carols. The guard opened the door to the mess hall. What Greta saw made her stop walking completely. The woman behind her bumped into her back. For a moment, nobody could move. They could only stare. The mess hall had been transformed. The usual bare tables were now covered with white tablecloths. Real tablecloths. Candles flickered in the center of each table, their light dancing across the room. Pine branches decorated the walls, filling the air with their fresh scent. At the far end of the room stood a Christmas tree, decorated with handmade ornaments and topped with a star made from tin cans. But it was the tables themselves that made Greta forget to breathe. They were covered with food, real food, more food than she had seen in years. Roasted turkeys, their skin golden brown, bowls of mashed potatoes with butter melting on top. Gravy in large serving bowls, fresh bread, vegetables and pies, actual pies for dessert. American soldiers stood around the room, many of them dressed in their best uniforms. Some were still singing carols. Others stood quietly watching the German prisoners enter. Captain Miller stood near the Christmas tree, a slight smile on his face. He gestured for the women to come in. To sit down, nobody moved at first. The German women stood frozen in the doorway, unable to process what they were seeing. This could not be real. This had to be some kind of trick or dream. Prisoners did not get feasts. Prisoners did not get Christmas celebrations. Prisoners got hard work and thin soup and cold bunks. Greta felt something wet on her cheek. She reached up and realized she was crying. She could not remember deciding to cry. The tears just came. She looked at the other women and saw the same thing happening to them. Frau Hoffmann had her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Even the guards seemed affected. Some of them looked away as if embarrassed. Liesel made a sound that was half sob and half gasp. Her knees buckled and she started to fall. Greta caught her, holding the younger woman up. Liesel cried openly now, her body shaking with sobs. Other women began to cry too. Years of fear and exhaustion and loss poured out of them all at once. They cried for their families. They cried for their dead. They cried for everything they had lost and everything they had endured. The American soldiers did not mock them. They did not tell them to stop crying. They simply waited, giving the women time to process what they were seeing. Captain Miller said something in English. The Austrian translator, who also had tears in her eyes, told the women to please sit down. The meal was for them. Slowly, hesitantly, the women moved into the room. They sat at the tables, still crying, still unable to believe this was happening. Greta sat at a table near the middle of the room. Liesel sat beside her, gripping her hand tightly. Frau Hoffmann sat across from them. None of them could speak. American soldiers began serving the food. They placed plates in front of each woman. They filled the plates with turkey and potatoes and gravy and vegetables. They poured water and coffee. They worked quietly, efficiently, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. Greta looked down at her plate. The food was real. The steam rising from the potatoes was real. The smell was real. This was actually happening, but why? Why were these American soldiers doing this? What did they want? Captain Miller stood and spoke again. The translator repeated his words in German. He said that Christmas was about remembering that all people were human. All people deserved dignity. Even in war, especially in war, some things had to remain sacred. Peace, compassion, the recognition that everyone, friend or enemy, was someone's daughter, someone's mother, someone's sister. Tonight they were not guards and prisoners. Tonight they were simply people sharing a meal on Christmas Eve. The room was silent except for the sound of crying. Then slowly some of the women began to eat. Greta picked up her fork with a shaking hand. She took a bite of turkey. The taste exploded in her mouth. Real meat, real food. She had forgotten what this felt like. She took another bite, then another. Around her, other women did the same. Across the room, American soldiers had also sat down to eat. Some of them smiled and nodded at the German women. Others ate quietly, lost in their own thoughts. One young soldier, very young, maybe 19 years old, kept glancing at the prisoners with an expression of deep sadness. Greta wondered what he was thinking. Did he have sisters at home? Did he see them when he looked at the German women? As the meal continued, something strange happened. The terrible tension that had filled the room began to ease slightly. Not completely, not even mostly, but enough that some women stopped crying, enough that they could eat without their hands shaking quite so badly. The food helped. Having something real and good after so much deprivation reminded them that life could still contain moments of goodness. Even now, even here, one of the American soldiers stood and began singing a Christmas carol. Others joined in. Their voices filled the room with a song about peace and joy. Some of the German women knew the same carol in German. A few of them very quietly began to sing along. The same song, different words, same hope. Greta finished her meal slowly, savoring every bite. When she was done, an American soldier brought her a piece of pie. Pumpkin pie. She had never tasted it before. It was sweet and spiced and wonderful. She ate it slowly, making it last as long as possible. Beside her, Liesel had stopped crying. She ate her food with the concentration of someone who had been hungry for too long. When she finished, she looked at Greta with an expression of confusion and wonder. Neither of them spoke. There were no words for this. As the evening continued, some American soldiers approached the tables where the German women sat. They did not get too close. They did not try to touch anyone. They simply stood at a respectful distance and nodded. Some said Merry Christmas in English. A few tried to say it in broken German. The women did not know how to respond, so they simply nodded back. The feast lasted for 2 hours. 2 hours of food and warmth, and an impossible kindness that none of the prisoners understood. When it was finally over, Captain Miller stood one last time. He wished everyone a peaceful Christmas. He hoped that someday soon the war would end and everyone could go home. Until then, he said, they would continue to treat all prisoners with the dignity that every human being deserved. The women were led back to their barracks through the snow. They walked in silence, but it was a different silence than before. Something had changed. Something fundamental had shifted in their understanding of what this place was, who these people were, what was possible even in the middle of a terrible war. That night, for the first time since their capture, some of the women slept peacefully. Christmas Day morning came quietly. There was no bell to wake them. The women woke on their own, slowly realizing that they were allowed to sleep, allowed to rest. It felt strange and almost wrong after weeks of rigid routine. Greta lay in her bunk for a long time, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the previous night. Had it really happened? Had the Americans really prepared a feast for their prisoners? The memory seemed impossible in the cold morning light, but it was real. Greta could still taste the food. She could still see the candles and the decorated tables. She could still hear the American soldiers singing carols. It had happened, but she still did not understand why. Around mid-morning, the women gathered in the barracks common area. They talked quietly about the feast. Some shared their memories of Christmas before the war. Frau Hoffmann told them about Christmas in her village in Bavaria. The church services, the children singing, the way the whole village would gather to celebrate together. That world felt like a lifetime ago now. Liesel spoke for the first time in days without crying. She talked about her mother's Christmas cookies, how they would bake together for an entire week before Christmas, how the apartment would smell of cinnamon and vanilla, how her mother would let her decorate the cookies with icing. Simple memories, precious memories, memories that hurt to recall because they highlighted everything that had been lost. In the afternoon, something unexpected happened. A young American soldier came to the barracks. He stood at the door awkwardly, holding his cap in his hands. The Austrian translator was with him. He asked if he could speak with some of the prisoners. Just talk, nothing official. Captain Miller had given permission. The women looked at each other nervously. Greta felt a flash of the old fear. Was this where the kindness ended? Was this when they found out what the Americans really wanted? But something about the young soldier's face made her pause. He looked nervous too, maybe even more nervous than they were. His name was Private Jackson. He was from a place called Iowa in the middle of America. He was 23 years old. Through the translator, he told the women that he wanted them to know that not all Americans saw them as enemies. He wanted them to know that many American soldiers were just regular people who had been pulled into this war. People who wanted it to end so they could go home. He pulled a photograph from his pocket. It showed a woman around 50 and a young girl maybe 16 years old. His mother and his sister. He showed it to the German women, his hands shaking slightly. He said his mother had worked as a school teacher. His sister wanted to be a nurse. He said when he looked at the German prisoners, he saw his own mother and sister. He saw people who had been caught up in something beyond their control. The room was completely silent. Every woman stared at the photograph. It could have been a German family. The woman could have been Frau Hoffmann. The girl could have been Liesel. There was nothing about them that screamed American or enemy. They were just people, family, loved ones. Frau Hoffmann stood slowly. She walked to where Private Jackson stood. She looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then she reached into her own pocket and pulled out something she had managed to hide from the guards during the initial search. It was a small worn photograph of a young man in a German uniform, her son, killed on the Eastern Front in 1943, fighting against the Russians. She showed the photograph to Private Jackson. Through the translator, she told him about her boy, about how he had loved music and wanted to be a teacher, about how he had died in a frozen forest thousands of miles from home, about how she would never see him again, about how the war had taken everything from her. Private Jackson looked at the photograph for a long time. When he looked up, there were tears in his eyes. He said he was sorry. Sorry for her loss. Sorry for all the losses. Sorry that the world had come to this. He said he hoped the war would end soon so no more mothers would have to lose their sons. Other women began to share their stories. One woman had lost her husband in North Africa. Another had lost 2 brothers. A third had lost her home in an Allied bombing raid. They talked about their losses, their fears, their hopes that someday this nightmare would end. Private Jackson listened to every story. He did not interrupt. He did not judge. He simply listened, and as he listened, something remarkable happened. The wall between captor and captive began to crack, not break entirely. The war was still happening. They were still enemies on paper, but in that moment, in that barracks, they were simply human beings recognizing each other's pain. After Private Jackson left, the women sat together in silence. Greta felt something inside her shift. For weeks she had survived by hardening her heart, by seeing the Americans as the enemy, by refusing to trust or feel anything. It was the only way to protect herself. But now that protection felt like a prison of its own. She thought about everything she had seen at this camp. The Americans had never hurt them, never starved them, never abused them. They had worked the prisoners, yes, but not cruelly. They had fed them well. They had treated them with basic dignity. And then on Christmas they had done something extraordinary. They had reminded the prisoners that they were still human beings worthy of compassion. Greta did not know what would happen next. The war was not over. Germany was losing, everyone knew that. When it ended, what would become of prisoners like her? Would she ever see her parents again? Would she ever go home? The future was uncertain and frightening. But something had changed. She had seen enemy soldiers choose kindness over cruelty. She had seen men who could have treated their prisoners like animals instead treat them like people. She had seen that even in the darkest times, humanity could still shine through. As evening fell on Christmas Day, the women gathered near the window of their barracks. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. The sky was clear. Stars filled the darkness like tiny points of hope. Somewhere in the camp, someone was playing Christmas music on a radio. The voices sang about peace on earth and goodwill toward men. Greta stood at the window with Liesel beside her. The younger woman had stopped crying. She looked calmer now, more at peace. She turned to Greta and spoke quietly. She said maybe there was hope after all. Maybe if American soldiers could see German prisoners as human beings, and if German prisoners could see American soldiers as human beings, maybe when the war finally ended, the world could heal. Maybe people could learn to see each other as people again instead of as enemies. Greta did not know if that was possible. The war had done terrible things to the world. It had broken so much that seemed beyond repair. Countries were destroyed. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were dead. The scars ran deep. Too deep, perhaps, to ever fully heal. But then she thought about the Christmas feast. She thought about Captain Miller saying that even in war, some things had to remain sacred. She thought about Private Jackson showing them his photograph and seeing their humanity. She thought about Frau Hoffmann sharing her grief with an enemy soldier, and that soldier sharing her pain. Small moments, small acts of kindness and recognition. But maybe that was how healing began, not with grand gestures or political treaties, but with one person seeing another person's humanity and choosing compassion over hate. One small moment at a time, one act of kindness building on another until maybe someday the world could be whole again. Greta did not know if she would survive the war. She did not know what the future held. But standing there at the window on Christmas night, watching the stars shine above a world at war, she felt something she had not felt in a long time. Hope. Not much. Just a small flicker. But it was there. The war would continue. Tomorrow they would return to work. The routine would resume. They were still prisoners. The Americans were still their captors. But something fundamental had shifted. They had all been reminded that beneath the uniforms and the flags and the rhetoric of war, they were all just people. People who loved and lost and hoped and feared. People who wanted to survive. People who wanted to go home. As Greta finally lay down to sleep that night, she whispered a prayer. Not to any particular God, just to whatever force might be listening. She prayed for the war to end. She prayed for all the soldiers on all sides to go home safely. She prayed for her parents in Munich that they were still alive. She prayed for Private Jackson and his mother and sister. And she prayed that someday, somehow, the world would remember how to be human again. Outside, the stars continued to shine. And in a prisoner camp in the middle of a war, a small group of women slept peacefully, carrying with them the memory of a Christmas feast and the hope that even in the darkest times, humanity could endure.